Hi class, my name is Melissa Celaya and today we're going to be talking about restraint and seclusion. So to start off, what is restraint and seclusion? And so restraint and seclusion are not really viewed as routine strategies. These are typically last resort responses reserved for really true crisis situations. These interventions should really only be used and employed in extreme and immediate situations, specifically when students pose really a significant threat of either serious physical harm to themselves or to others. And even then, the decision to really use these strategies must be made with the utmost caution, clarity, and responsibility. And they should only be done by someone who is certified to be able to do restraints. Restraint and seclusion must never be incorporated into a behavior plan, um, or to be used as some kind of form of punishment, or to be mistaken as a therapeutic intervention. Um, the application must be guided and by really strict ethical considerations, legal mandates, and professional integrity. It's super essential to really understand the gravity of these practices. You know, that it can potentially be misused, it can cause trauma, be mindful of damaging that rapport that you may have had with the kiddo, and any like legalities. It's always really important to consult with relevant laws, regulations, and district policies before proceeding with any kind of restraints or seclusions. Many states will require specialized training and certifications in order to even perform these interventions, both legally and safely. It's important to know that, again, restraint and seclusion, they're not the first line of response. We should be using de escalation prevention strategies, crisis communication first prior to even going down this route. Behaviors that really appear threatening, are always a form of some kind of communication, whether it's one of the functions of behavior, which is either going to be for them to be wanting to escape from a place, wanting some kind of attention, anything that has to do with tangibles, or maybe some sensory. And so again, it's just an attempt for them to really communicate what they might be really feeling internally. And I think it's important to really recognize the behavior, or the function of that behavior, so that we can know what is the best way to respond appropriately and compassionately. Specifically in Arizona, for instance, there are laws that regulate physical restraints. Um, and they do state that any technique used must not impede a student's ability to breathe and must be proportionate to the student's age, size, and physical condition. Similar to California, where I live, the use of physical restraint in educational settings is strictly regulated to really ensure the number one focus is going to be on student safety and their dignity. So what are the different types of restraints? So we have physical restraints, mechanical restraints, and seclusion. So in terms of physical restraint, it's essentially just going to be a person who is using their body to restrict another person's movement. It is meant to prevent them from harm in emergency situations and is typically very temporary until kiddos back to baseline. An example of this would be to hold a kiddo's arm down so they cannot hit themselves, right? That might be like the first tier. Some takeaways for that one is that staff must be trained. They must not restrict air or blood flow, and it's only used for immediate danger. Mechanical restraints is the use of a device or object to limit a person's movement. So an example would be straps, to keep a kiddo either sitting on a chair or laying down, in a very specific location to limit movement. A key takeaway is that it is highly restrictive, and it is typically prohibited in most schools. Seclusion, the definition of that is an involuntarily confining an individual alone in a room or space from which they are physically prevented from leaving. An example would be placing a student in a designated room or space to return to baseline against their will. So here we have to be mindful, this is against their will. And key takeaways is that this is typically heavily restricted and prohibited in many states. And there can be a lot of legal things that come if this happens. Some concepts or ideas that were new to me. Something that really deeply struck me when learning about this was really the devastating impact that restraining seclusion has on students. The readings talked about that it sometimes leads to trauma, self-harm, and sometimes even suicide. And so before, I really hadn't considered that this would be misused, or that the power that could be abused in moments like these. It's really unsettling to realize that a lot of educators or caregivers, whether it's lack through training or just simple disregard to ethical responsibility, have caused serious psychological or even physical harm to the children that they're meant to keep safe and support. In 2014, Arizona responded to these concerns by passing legislation that prohibits the use of restraints and seclusion in schools, except in instances where there's imminent risk to bodily harm. Um, what's more telling is that there's an overwhelming majority of professionals in education and behavioral health agree that restraint and seclusion offer no therapeutic or educational value. These aren't just like procedural concerns, they're moral ones. And we really urge people to critically examine how we respond to children in distress or in crisis, and challenge us to lead with empathy and not control. And then lastly, my experience with restraining seclusion. I have worked and managed short-term residential facilities for pregnant and parenting girls between the ages of 12 and 18. I've worked as an RBT in the field of ABA with both children and adults with autism. And then finally, I've worked in both public and private elementary schools for 7, going on 8 years. So within my multifaceted roles, I have had to restrain individuals multiple times. I've done single restraints, double restraints, and multi-personal restraints. I've done standing, sitting, walking restraints, pretty much all the possible things that could happen. I've done them. I have also been a part of seclusion and two, which was very traumatic. Reading all the information from this week and from all the other resources that I gathered, it really brought me back to those memories of when I had to do restraints. I remember I always had to take a break after it happened. Either I had to take a break or I had to go home, because it's incredibly traumatic, for the person who was doing the restraining, and even more traumatic for the person who is being restrained. I have cried, I have felt physically and emotionally hurt after the fact and during. And although sometimes I do think that it is necessary to restrain when it becomes a very big safety issue, I think it's still traumatic no matter what for everyone that's involved. And I can recall plenty of times where I did not want to restrain, but I was told to restrain, and so I did. And I just think that with really good crisis management skills, the need for restraining seclusion is very minimal. I have been in positions where I was choked out, and while being choked, I'm using crisis communication, crisis intervention to get them to let go. And I didn't need to restrain. I didn't need to do anything of that, because it's just a matter of like really working off that rapport that you have with the kiddo, and then just, managing your way about it with your words rather than your physical body. Aside from that, thank you so much. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.